What are 3 things you think about when it comes to the perfect aquarium plant? 1, low lighting requirements. 2, adaptability to fluctuating water chemistry. And 3, extremely fast growing and easy to propagate. You know the saying, be careful what you wish for, because you might just get it. What's going on, guys? Joseph from H2O Plants. Today we're going to actually be going in depth on the world's best aquatic plant. So those 3 traits have manifested themselves in an aquatic plant that has now become probably the world's most perfect aquatic plant. But it's a double-edged sword because this plant is highly invasive, highly illegal here, at least in the United States and many other countries around the world. And it has taken over a large amount of water bodies just in our country alone. But before we get into what exactly the plan is, we gotta take a road trip to see if we can find any. Alright, so me and Hector are on our way. That's Hector. For those of you that don't know, he is my fiance's son. Anyway, we're off to find this plant. So can you move this? Okay, so we are at the lake here. We're gonna walk around and look for it. I don't see it just yet, but I'm assuming that we'll probably come along it. I mean, you can see it's a huge lake. It's probably like a mile or 2 big, so we're gonna take a look around, see what we can find.
We're seeing lots of rocks here.
Yeah. So let's see what we can find. All right, so I think we found some right in this little pool of water. Hector's got the net. I'm gonna have him scoop some out, and hopefully he doesn't fall in the process. So, it's hard to tell, really hard to tell, but I think that this might be it. There's bugs on it. It has little serrations along the leaves, and I do believe this is actually it. It looks a lot like it, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna go down to another part where I could get some water. Yeah. We got our little container here. That way it doesn't dry out. I'm pretty sure this has gotta be it. Alright guys, and we're back, and I have the sample here. It's actually been a couple days since we went collecting, and I do have to say, without a doubt, it is the species I thought it was and the species we were looking for. So what plant is this that we're looking for exactly? Well, I asked a bunch of you guys on Instagram what this plant was to see how many people actually knew, and really only about 3 out of a ton of people actually got it right. So for those of you that didn't know what it is Hydrilla. And a large portion of you probably never even heard of this plant. But if you live around an area where it's commonly found here in the United States, then you know very well what it is. Or maybe you don't, and you just have seen it in your lake or local water body and think that it's a natural species. But it's not. It's actually a highly invasive species and federally regulated, where you can't even import this plant into the United States anymore in any area. It's classified as an invasive species in every single state here in the United States. So before we get into the rest of the video, I just want to let you guys know, do not go and get this plant from the wild. Do not collect it. It is a highly invasive species. It can wreak havoc on waterways if it gets into it. The only reason why I collected it is to be able to demonstrate it in this video. However, this plant is not going in any of our tanks or anywhere else that I cannot control it. It is only staying in this container until I'm ready to dispose of it, which I will do so by drying it completely out and burning it when I'm ready to. But I don't know what was treated in that water as far as the damage that it could do to an ecosystem or anything like that. So this plant will not be introduced into any tanks or anything like that. It is not a plant that should be put in an aquarium. However, if this plant is local to you in a water body, I do recommend, if you are interested, contacting your local Department of Agriculture or your Parks Department, whoever maintains that body of water, and asking them if there's anything that you can do to hopefully help remove that plant. Now, if they say, hey, we need volunteers to go out and rake it out, maybe that's something you can do and do good for your local water body. But I did want to use this video to kind of put a spotlight on this plant, and this video kind of serves as the purpose of, don't go out introducing stuff that shouldn't be there in nature. Don't dump your fish tank in the water of a pond that may be local to you just because you feel bad for it or you don't have any other way of getting rid of it. Ask hobbyists, bring your stuff to a local fish store. They'll usually gladly take it, and if not, search on Facebook. People will gladly take free stuff if you don't want it anymore. This goes for not only plants but also fish. Don't just release it into the wild because it can wreak havoc. But before we go into exactly what Hydrilla is, I want to touch base on what makes an invasive species such as plants actually become invasive. And this is very important to know because everybody thinks that if you just take a plant and put it in the wild, it's going to become invasive. Now, this is possible, and I don't recommend you taking your plants and putting them in a local body of water that it doesn't belong in. It can become invasive, but it's important to understand how a plant becomes invasive. So it's something called the 10-10-10-1 rule, or it's basically 1 out of every 1,000 plants will become an invasive plant. Also 0.1%. So when you think about that, there's a lot of plants out there and only 0.1% will actually become invasive. But that 0.1% could become highly invasive in your local area, so I don't recommend releasing your plants around you. Basically, the way the 10-10-10-1 rule works is for every 10 plants that is imported, 1 of those plants will be introduced into the wild. For every 10 plants that are introduced into the wild, 1 will become established, meaning that it will actually grow in that area and be able to sustain itself. And for every 10 plants that get established, 1 of those plants will actually become invasive, where it will actually outcompete and or harm other nearby plants, which will allow it to outcompete and become the dominant species in that area. Now, there's several reasons on why a plant can become invasive, so much so that you can't really narrow it down to just one little thing, but there's a lot of factors. Usually it's a combination between lack of natural pests in the area or diseases. It's better suited for the new environment from which it came from. Some plants can even use allelopathy, which is basically chemical warfare to either destroy soil or destroy nearby plants, hence killing competing species and allowing it to thrive. We'll do more on allelopathy in a future video, but these are all things that can attribute to an invasive plant when it's brought from one area of the world to another. But now let's get into the specifics of Hydrilla. Hydrilla was originally introduced into the United States around 1950 to 1960 through the aquarium hobby. It is believed that somebody imported it from Eurasia into the United States, and at one point that person decided to go and release those plants into the wild for some reason. So this plant being here in the United States is solely on our shoulders as the aquarium hobby, and we should really know more about it so some of us may be able to do something about it in the future. So Hydrilla is a fully submersible plant. It will not grow out of the water. However, it does grow in thick mats covering areas of the water body. It can basically choke out other plants in the area because it only needs 1% light to grow, meaning it can grow at a substantially low amount of light, and it grows earlier in the day than other plants, being that it only needs that amount of light. And because it only needs such a little amount of light to grow, it can actually grow up to 25 foot deep in any sort of water body. And it's also a perennial plant, meaning that it actually does not need any vegetation to come back because it has other forms of reproduction. Those consist of tubers that grow underground. The tubers tend to be little potato-looking things. They're under the ground and they're about a half an inch big. Also seed pods that form from the flowers. And if it doesn't actually live in a region where it would be killed by frost, it can actually propagate through fragmentation, which is most of our stem plants in the aquarium hobby. When you cut them, they can repropagate into new stems. Now, when we were collecting this plant from the wild, I was really confused on if it was actually the plant it was, because it actually resembles 2 other plants that we actually sell as aquarium plants. That is Anacris and Anacris densa, also called Eliota. So Anacris densa is considered an invasive plant in some of the states here in the United States. However, regular Anacris is native to our region. The way you can tell Hydrilla and Anacris apart are very simple. If you look at Hydrilla, it has little serrations along the outsides of its leaves, where Anacris, both Eliota densa and regular Anacris that's native to the United States, does not have that serration. They're also much different just looking at them in person. If you had all 3 species laid out like I do, you'll be able to tell that they're all different just based on their size and shape and how they have different levels of leaves and whatnot. You could really tell the difference in person, but if you don't have them to compare it against, you really won't know unless you're familiar with the plant itself. So oftentimes people that see it in their lake may confuse it for either of those plants and not know that it's actually Hydrilla. Because of Hydrilla's propagation methods, it is way worse than either of the Anacra species because of those tubers and the seed pods can repropagate the plant even when it completely dies back. Those tubers can actually stay underground for anywhere between 4 and 8 years and still sprout afterwards. But they're able to sprout all new plants. The problem with that is when you try and chemically treat the water to get rid of the plant, the chemicals cannot kill the tubers, so the tubers still last. So even if you chemically treated the lake, much like the lake we visited, there's still tubers underground that allow the plant to propagate and regrow year after year. Hydrilla is also highly adaptable to salinity levels, so it actually is able to grow in about 7% salinity. So the reason why Hydrilla is a big problem here in the United States is because it is an invasive plant, and being an invasive plant can actually hurt our ecosystem. What it does is it can actually kind of drown out any other native plants by forming thick mats of its leaves and stems, which drown out light to the plants below it. It also allows smaller fish and smaller insects to thrive because it forms this thick mat, and it doesn't allow predator fish to be able to eat those sources of food, which then allows the predators to die off, so it impacts native predator fish that may be in your local stream or water body that are highly involved in the natural ecosystem of that place. Hydrilla is a really big problem also for wildlife, not only aquatic but also birds, because what happens, as we just saw, a duck likes to eat Hydrilla. And what happens is Hydrilla is known to harbor cyanobacteria, which has a nasty neurotoxin that can actually impact the health of the bird. That's not to say that the duck will become paralyzed, but it's actually been linked to killing bald eagles because the bald eagles, as a predator of ducks, eat ducks which have ingested all of that cyanobacteria and have that neurotoxin built up in their system. So when the bald eagle eats it, it gets that neurotoxin and it can cause bald eagles to die. So Hydrilla can also impact humans because it does a lot of things to the environment. One, it decreases water flow, so if you ever have a boat on a lake that's infested with it, it can become really hard to move through it, as well as canoeing. Swimming is almost impossible in a thick mat of Hydrilla, and it also could cause flooding as the plant decreases water flow and allows water to build up in areas, and it allows it to start flooding. Hydrilla also costs millions and millions of dollars a year to try and get rid of in local water bodies. Florida alone has spent millions year after year trying to control this plant, as well as many other regions of the world have actually spent tons of money trying to contain it. Now, there's several ways that people have been trying to combat the spread of Hydrilla. Some methods are chemicals, which chemicals work to destroy the vegetation but will not destroy the tubers. So year after year, the plant can continue to come back. Okay, and actually one of the things that I wasn't sure if they're actually doing anything for this lake to treat the pests, such as Hydrilla, but you could see here, pesticide treated water. Aquatic herbicide sonar has been applied to this lake. These herbicides have been applied to control aquatic vegetation, although they spelled aquatic wrong. Restrictions on the use of treated waters. So basically it just goes to show no swimming, no fish consumption, nothing like that. They're treated waters. And you can see why if we take a closer look right down here, and we'll zoom in to that spot as much as possible without actually going in the lake. But you can see there the mat of plants, hopefully. That's right there, the roundish shaped leaves. That's all Hydrilla right there. So another option is sterile grass carp. Now these grass carp will actually eat the plant, but they will also eat other native species, but the fish itself will not reproduce. So eventually, after years and years, those fish will die off. The plant will hopefully be eaten and destroyed over time, and the ecosystem could go back to its natural ways. Another method is actually laying a tarp on the bottom of the water body. This will actually suffocate the plant as well as anything else and not allow it to grow year after year. So this is a good way to remove any plants that may have the tubers below the ground. However, it does kill other native species, so it can actually impact the environment in a negative way also. Another thing to note when destroying Hydrilla, when they took it out of the water and they put it into a controlled environment and just allowed it to die naturally, they realized that the decaying plant matter actually affected the water parameters, which could actually impact the fish and other wildlife in that water body. So introducing chemicals and having a large die-off of hydrilla, and that could be devastating to the other fish and livestock that may live in that area. So another method that I came across during my research for this video was actually a pretty clever one. This person obtained a permit from their local government to actually rake harvest the hydrilla from their local body of water. And what are they doing with the hydrilla? Well, they're chopping it up and throwing it in a compost pile. But they were obviously making sure that that water body is not treated with chemicals by working with their local government, but they are yearly harvesting it for their compost pile. And the reason being is hydrilla is actually considered a superfood. So now this is where the story gets really interesting. So because hydrilla can grow so fast and outcompete other species and just can take over an area, and it being a superfood, it contains a lot of nutrients. So hydrilla actually has the possibilities to beat out spirulina and wheatgrass as a superfood because of its vigorous growing styles that actually hurt our local water bodies. Hydrilla contains the most calcium out of any other plant in the world. But not only that, hydrilla also contains an abundant amount of chromium, selenium, iron, manganese, zinc, and silica. Not to mention, it also has some of the highest concentrations of a plant-based vitamin B12, which commonly comes from protein in foods. Because all these vitamins are made naturally inside of hydrilla, they actually are absorbed better into the human body than synthetic vitamins are. Not to mention, in recent studies, hydrilla has been shown to contain polysaccharides, which are linked to immune and health boosting properties, along with a rare molecule known as adenines, and I'm probably butchering that name, A and B, which have strong anti-tumor effects. Now, I'm not saying to go out and pull out hydrilla from your local water body, compost it, or dry it out and eat it, but they do actually have supplements on Amazon that you can buy that is farmed hydrilla that is dried, and you can use it as like almost like a protein powder. So it also has the ability to be really good cattle food or chicken feed. It contains 16% more fodder than cattails does. In fact, in one study, cows that were fed hydrilla produced 20% more milk, and chickens actually produced 14% more eggs. And this is probably related to its calcium content. That's really it, guys. Leave me a comment down below. Let me know what you think of hydrilla. Is this something that we should maybe utilize more than we are instead of just trying to get rid of it? Or should we just eradicate it as best as possible and hopefully it doesn't come back? From that, I do think that it does have multiple purposes, not just to be destroyed, but I think we can use it for a lot of good if we did it the right way. If you want to help support making videos like this, you can visit our shop, h2oplants.com, and buy some plants for your aquarium. Not invasive plants like hydrilla, but other plants. If you're new here, you can click that button up there to subscribe. If you want to check out what we did with the mountainscape tank, you can click right there. If you want to check out the other invasive plant that we had invade the desert tank, you can click down there. And we'll see you guys on the next one.